The building at 1200 North Glebe Road in Arlington, Virginia, was deliberately forgettable. Rebecca Martinez had passed it 100 times during her years with the FBI, never once wondering what happened behind its unmarked concrete facade. She'd never imagined she'd actually enter it. Now, as she stepped through the security checkpoint, metal detectors that seemed almost ceremonial, guards whose faces were carefully constructed blanks, she felt the weight of transition pressing against her chest. This was a threshold. She could feel it in the recycled air, in the humming of the overhead fluorescent lights, in the way her credentials were scanned 3 separate times before she was allowed to proceed down the sterile corridor. The office was on the 4th floor, room 412, marked only with a number on a brushed aluminum plaque. Rebecca knocked, her knuckles producing a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. A voice, male, neither young nor old, called her inside. The man sitting behind the mahogany desk had no name tag, no placard identifying his position, no visible indication of rank or authority. What he did have was presence. He was perhaps 60, with gray hair cut military short, and eyes that carried the particular weariness of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that would never be public. On the desk between them lay a folder, its cover stamped in red letters, classified above top secret. Her file. "Agent Martinez," he said, not standing, not offering his hand. "Thank you for coming." Rebecca sat in the chair opposite him without being invited. She'd learned years ago that hesitation in situations like this conveyed weakness. "You didn't give me much choice, sir." The message said it was urgent. A smile flickered across the man's face, approval perhaps. He opened the folder carefully as if the papers inside might detonate. 17 commendations. Hostage Rescue Team FBI, 4 international operations, 3 domestic, 0 casualties among hostages recovered, 0 civilian casualties, perfect record. He looked up. "How do you do it, Agent Martinez?" "I train well, I stay calm under pressure, I have good partners." "No," he closed the folder. His fingers remained on top of it, pressing down as if to contain something trying to escape. "You do something else. Something that doesn't appear in training manuals or standard psychological evaluations. You see things other people don't see. You anticipate threats before they materialize. You make decisions that shouldn't work, but they do." He paused. 3 times in the last 5 years, you've made tactical calls that contradicted direct orders from your commanding officers. All 3 times you were correct. All 3 times your disobedience saved lives. Rebecca's jaw tightened. She hadn't known that her file was being analyzed at this level. Those were extraordinary circumstances. "Exactly," he leaned forward. "Which is why we're here. The United States Navy has a problem, Agent Martinez. Our most elite operators, SEALs, Special Warfare Command, they're exceptional, but they're trained within rigid frameworks. The world doesn't operate in rigid frameworks anymore. Our enemies don't play by established rules. We need something different, someone different." The room felt smaller suddenly. Rebecca could hear her own heartbeat, steady but quickening. "What are you proposing?" The man stood and walked to a window that overlooked Arlington's urban sprawl. His silhouette was backlit, making his features harder to read. "A program that doesn't officially exist. A recruitment that you'll never be allowed to discuss. A service contract that will require you to disappear from your current life, not physically, but effectively. You'll have a cover, an official position, but your real work will exist in spaces that don't appear on any organizational chart." "That's illegal," Rebecca said quietly. "No," he turned back to face her. "It's classified. There's a difference. We operate under presidential authority and congressional oversight. Black budget, yes, but legitimate. What we're building is a response to threats that conventional special operations can't adequately address. We need operators who can think beyond the military orthodoxy. We need people who can make decisions in gray zones where the law is ambiguous and the stakes are absolute." Rebecca's mouth was dry. She'd spent 17 years in law enforcement, in institutions that had rigid chains of command, clear legal boundaries, defined rules of engagement. What this man was describing sounded like a complete inversion of everything that had defined her career. And yet, and this was the part that terrified her, it was exactly what she'd always wanted. The part of her that had chafed against regulations, that had questioned orders when those orders felt wrong, that had gone rogue 3 times and been vindicated each time. That part was roaring to life. "Who else knows about this?" she asked. "Your immediate supervisor knows you're being transferred to a special assignment. That's all. Beyond this room, you don't exist, Agent Martinez. Your cover will be complete. Your real family, your personal relationships, those will continue, but they won't be your priority. Your life will belong to this program." She thought of David, her girlfriend of 4 years. They'd been talking about moving to Portland, about building a normal life together. She thought about her mother in New Mexico, who still called every Sunday to ask when Rebecca was coming home for a visit. She thought about the apartment in Alexandria she'd decorated with care, the yoga classes she attended, the book club she'd been part of for 2 years. All of that would have to become secondary, or disappear entirely. "What happens if I refuse?" she asked. "You walk out of here and return to your normal assignment. We classify this conversation and you never hear from us again. No consequences, no punishment, just a quiet exit." But there was something in his eyes that suggested that exit would be watched, that she'd be flagged in some database she'd never know about, that opportunities would quietly dry up. "And if I accept?" He reached into a drawer and removed a pen, a form, and a flash drive. "You sign the secrecy agreement. You memorize the information on the drive and destroy it. You show up to a location in California next Monday. You disappear into the forge. And in 3 years, if you survive it, if you prove capable, you'll become something the world has never seen before." Rebecca picked up the pen. Her hand was steady even though her thoughts were a hurricane. She thought about those 3 times she'd disobeyed orders and been right. She thought about the 17 commendations that felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who played by rules she'd stopped believing in years ago. She signed. As her pen crossed the final line of her old life, the man nodded slowly. "Welcome, Agent Martinez. By the way, once you complete the program, if you complete the program, they'll give you a call sign, something that captures who you've become." He smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "Based on your file, I'm betting they call you something predatory, something that hunts." Rebecca set down the pen. She understood in that moment that she'd just signed away not just her career, but her identity. What would emerge from the forge wouldn't be Rebecca Martinez anymore. That woman would have to die so that something sharper, deadlier, and far more dangerous could take her place. "When do I start?" she whispered. "Monday," he said. "Don't say goodbye to anyone, just disappear." She picked up the flash drive with trembling fingers and left the room. The Black Hawk helicopter descended into darkness so complete it seemed sentient. Rebecca gripped the safety line with both hands, her stomach dropping not just from the altitude but from the finality of the moment. Below, somewhere in the Sierra Nevada mountains, the facility that had no name waited for her. The facility they called the Forge. She'd signed the papers 5 days ago. She'd told David she was being transferred overseas for a classified assignment, something that would take her away for several months. Her mother's phone call had gone to voicemail. There was no coming back from this jump. The descent was deliberately brutal. The helicopter landed in a clearing illuminated by nothing but moonlight and the aircraft's running lights. Before Rebecca could unbuckle her harness, the doors were open and hands were pulling her down into the cold Sierra air. The helicopter lifted away immediately, the sound diminishing rapidly until she stood alone, or what felt like alone, in absolute darkness. A voice, gravel-rough and scarred by decades of shouting orders, came from somewhere ahead. "You have 30 seconds to move toward my voice before I stop caring about your location." Rebecca moved. She ran forward into the darkness, hands raised to protect her face, her mind already calculating angles and distances from the sound source. Her military training kicked in automatically. Never run directly toward the voice, maintain distance, assess the situation. She angled left, then moved in a wide arc to approach the voice from a position of advantage. The man who emerged from the shadows was enormous. 6'4", maybe 260, with a face like weathered granite and eyes that had seen things Rebecca hoped never to experience. His name was Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, and he was going to spend the next 90 days making her wish she'd never signed those papers. "Good," he said, the word clipped and efficient. "You don't follow orders blindly. That's the first thing that makes you different from every SEAL who's come through here. The second thing is that you're going to fail at least 50% of what we ask you to do. The question is whether you'll quit before we do." Rebecca's breathing was steady, despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I don't quit, sir." Morrison's laugh was genuinely amused, which somehow was worse than if he'd been angry. "Everyone quits. Everyone has a breaking point. We're going to find yours." The first week was designed specifically to break her. They kept her awake for 72 hours straight, running scenarios that had no solutions. Hostage situations where every tactical approach resulted in simulated casualties. Intelligence puzzles where the data contradicted itself. Decisions where saving one group meant sacrificing another. Rebecca was rotated through a series of instructors, all former special operators, all carrying the particular hardness of men who'd made life-and-death decisions and lived with the consequences. They watched her with the kind of skepticism usually reserved for carnival fortune tellers. A woman, in an elite black ops program. The disbelief was palpable. By day 10, Rebecca understood the first brutal truth of the Forge. This wasn't a military training facility. This was a crucible designed to forge a specific kind of operator, someone who could think faster than her fear, who could make decisions without moral paralysis, who could operate in the gray spaces where warfare became something else entirely. The physical training was almost secondary. Yes, she ran until her legs felt like they'd separate from her hips. Yes, she went through obstacle courses designed by sadists, carrying 100-pound rucksacks through mud and fire. Yes, she learned combat knife techniques from an instructor who moved like he was conducting a dark symphony. But the real training happened in the classroom. In week 3, Morrison gave her a scenario. A high-value target was being held in a fortified compound in a foreign city. The target had intel about 3 active terror cells. The catch, and there was always a catch, was that extracting the target would require her to kill 12 guards, destroy evidence that would incriminate a U.S. ally government, and potentially trigger a diplomatic incident. Extract the target and risk an international crisis. Leave him and lose intelligence that could prevent attacks on American soil. Most operators would have asked for permission, asked for higher authority guidance, tried to defer the decision upward. Rebecca didn't. She sketched out a plan that involved extracting the target, burning the evidence in a way that looked accidental, and leaving enough plausible deniability that no one could prove American involvement. The plan was ruthless, elegant, and morally murky. Morrison watched her presentation in silence. When she finished, he simply nodded. That single nod meant everything had changed. By week 6, the other instructors started asking her for advice on their scenarios. By week 8, younger operators who were rotating through, actual SEALs doing cross-training, were watching her during tactical exercises with something approaching reverence. She could see threat patterns before they formed. She could anticipate ambushes by reading barely perceptible environmental clues. She moved through scenarios like she could see 3 steps into the future. In week 10, during a night navigation exercise, Morrison was watching from the observation post when Rebecca did something that made even him catch his breath. She was being pursued through rough terrain by a training team designed to capture her. Instead of running, instead of hiding, she did something unexpected. She stopped, turned around, and walked directly toward her pursuers. Morrison watched through thermal imaging as she approached the lead team, engaged them in conversation, what looked like negotiation, and then two of the pursuers simply escorted her to the extraction point. Later in the debrief, Rebecca explained, "They were expecting me to fight or flee. Neither option ended well. I changed the game. I approached with confidence, suggested I was there by choice, and the lead operative decided I was more valuable extracted than contained." Morrison leaned back in his chair and studied her with new eyes. "You just manipulated hardened military operators through psychological insight and confidence." "Yes, sir. That's not in any manual we teach." "No, sir, it's not." He was silent for a long moment. Then, "We're going to give you a call sign, something that captures what you are. The other operators have been talking. They want to call you Falcon." Rebecca didn't ask why, she understood. Falcons hunted with devastating precision. They moved through the air with impossible grace. They saw prey from heights others couldn't reach, and when they struck, they were absolute. By the end of the 12-week program, Rebecca had fundamentally transformed. She'd learned to kill with her hands, her mind, and psychological manipulation. She'd learned to move through spaces invisible. She'd learned that the difference between victory and defeat often wasn't strength. It was the willingness to ask questions conventional operators considered heretical. On the final day, all the instructors gathered to watch her complete the graduation exercise. A full tactical operation against a mock compound, conducted alone, with every mistake resulting in simulated death. Rebecca executed it perfectly. No wasted movement, no hesitation, no mercy. As she walked out of the compound, Morrison was waiting with a black operational duffel bag. "Welcome to the program, Falcon," he said quietly. "You're about to learn that there are missions regular SEALs aren't allowed to run. Missions that need someone who can operate beyond all rules. That's you now." Rebecca took the duffel bag. Inside would be her first real assignment briefing, details about an operation that would define everything she was becoming. She was no longer Rebecca Martinez. She was Falcon. The Hindu Kush Mountains were a graveyard of empires. Rebecca knew the history. Soviets, British, countless Afghan warriors had died here in these peaks and valleys, their bones bleached by decades of wind. Now it was her turn to become either history or legend. She crouched on a ridgeline 300 meters from the target compound, watching it through thermal imaging that turned the night into a landscape of green and yellow heat signatures. Her radio earpiece crackled softly with the voice of SEAL Team Leader Commander Marcus Hayes, the man leading the extraction team that waited 3 kilometers back, ready to move on her signal. "Falcon, this is Anvil Lead," Hayes whispered into the comms. "We're reading 23 heat signatures in the compound. Thermal shows concentrated positions at 3 entry points, main gate, east corridor, and what looks like a command center in the western section. The target should be in the central detention area. Are you good to proceed?" Rebecca's eyes moved across the compound like a chess master analyzing a board. 23 targets was more than they'd intelligence suggested. Someone had screwed up the reconnaissance, or the target had reinforced his position. Either way, it meant the situation was more dangerous than the briefing had indicated. But danger was why she existed now. "Affirmative, Anvil Lead," she responded. "I'm going dark. I'll signal when I have the target isolated." She switched off her radio. Communication now would be a liability. What she was about to do required perfect silence and total focus. Rebecca rose from her position with the movement of smoke, controlled, deliberate, invisible. She was wearing full tactical gear. Suppressed HK-417 rifle, combat knife, flash bangs, 2 sidearms, a rucksack containing equipment for extraction. She moved like the mountain itself had weight, each step calculated for silence, for speed, for absolute efficiency. The perimeter of the compound was predictable. Humans always established predictable patterns. Guards rotated in a 45-minute cycle, which meant there was a 7-minute window when the eastern approach would have minimal coverage. Rebecca moved through that window like a ghost, her body low, her breathing controlled. At the fence line, she didn't cut through. That would leave evidence. Instead, she found the weak point where the fence had been poorly maintained and moved through the gap she'd identified on reconnaissance. Total time, 90 seconds. Inside the compound grounds, she was in maximum danger territory. The courtyard was open, exposed, with nowhere to hide if she was spotted. Rebecca didn't run. She walked. Walking looked purposeful, confident, less likely to trigger the freeze response in a sentry's mind. She had memorized the guard positions, the timing of spotlight sweeps, the psychological patterns of bored soldiers. She walked across that courtyard like she belonged there, like she had authorization to be there, and no one challenged her because her confidence suggested she was exactly where she should be. The rear entrance had a lock mechanism her briefing documents had shown her. She placed a small electronic device against it, a bypass tool that had taken the program's engineers 6 months to develop, and the lock clicked open silently. She was inside the building. The hallway beyond was dimly lit by emergency lighting. Rebecca could hear voices from the main room, harsh, accented voices speaking Pashto. Guards talking, laughing about something, completely unaware of the predator moving through their fortress. She moved along the wall with the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield, because for her, every shadow contained the potential for death. At the first checkpoint, a guard sat at a desk reviewing documents. He would be the first person to die, though he didn't know it yet. Rebecca moved to his position with such speed and silence that he never even looked up. Her knife was clean and swift, entering between his ribs with a surgeon's precision, angled upward to sever his aorta. He opened his mouth, but she had her hand over it, preventing sound. He died making a small whimpering noise that sounded almost like he was being comforted. Rebecca lowered his body to the desk, arranged him so he appeared to still be working, and moved deeper into the compound. The detention area was through 2 more corridors. At each junction, she paused, scanning for thermal signatures beyond walls. She could read the compound's layout in her mind now, could visualize where people stood, where vulnerabilities existed. When she encountered the second guard, a younger man, probably in his 20s, walking a patrol route that would bring him directly into contact with her, she didn't kill him. Instead, she pressed herself into a corner, let him walk past, then struck with enough force to render him unconscious. 2 kills maximum per infiltration. That was the rule. After that, people started assuming there was an intruder rather than someone who belonged. The detention block had 3 cells. In the middle one, bound to a chair, was Malik Hakim, a Taliban commander with intelligence about 3 active cells planning attacks on American bases. The man was barely conscious, tortured, clearly expecting execution rather than rescue. When Rebecca cut his bonds, his first instinct was to cry out. She placed a hand over his mouth, firm, commanding, and stared into his eyes with such intensity that his fear transformed into compliance. She pressed a pistol into his hands. A test. Would he take it and use it? Would he try to run? Would he compromise the extraction with panic? He held the pistol with shaking hands, understanding without language that he'd been given agency over his own survival. Quiet, she whispered in Pashto, a language she'd spent the last 3 weeks studying. We move now. You stay behind me. You do exactly what I do. You understand. He nodded. They moved back through the corridors with agonizing slowness. Rebecca was carrying more weight now, both her equipment and the psychological burden of keeping Hakim alive and moving. Outside the compound, they were most vulnerable. The courtyard crossing had to happen during the spotlight sweep cycle, which meant Rebecca was calculating angles, timing, probability in real time. The explosion came as a shock. Behind them, at the eastern quadrant of the compound, something detonated. Not their doing. Rebecca's mind analyzed in a fraction of a second. Someone had discovered the unconscious guard and triggered an alarm, or there was a secondary security system she hadn't detected. Doesn't matter. adjust, adapt. Run, she told Hakim, and this time they sprinted across the courtyard, all pretense of stealth abandoned. Gunfire erupted behind them, the sound of confusion and panic, guards firing at movement they didn't understand. Rebecca didn't return fire. She had one objective: get Hakim out alive. Everything else was noise. They hit the fence line at a full sprint. Rebecca half-carried the wounded prisoner through the gap, and they were over the ridgeline as the compound descended into chaos. Behind them, soldiers were pouring out of buildings, shouting, firing in every direction. Smoke was rising from the eastern section. Rebecca's radio crackled. "Falcon, this is Anvil Lead. We read contact. Extraction in 5 minutes." "Affirmative," Rebecca responded, breathing hard but controlled. "Target is secured, bringing him in." The rope line was waiting 300 meters away, in a valley that provided cover from the compound's sightlines. Rebecca practically dragged Hakim down the mountainside, her movements still precise despite the adrenaline overload. When they reached the extraction point, the SEAL team was geared up and ready, weapons trained outward to provide cover. Commander Hayes appeared in front of her, and for a moment his eyes, hard, professional, skeptical, met hers. She was covered in blood that wasn't hers. She'd killed 2 men silently. She'd extracted the target from an impossible position. And she was still breathing steadily, still focused, still operational. "Welcome to the real war, Falcon," Hayes said quietly. Behind him, the other SEALs were staring at her with expressions somewhere between awe and something approaching fear. She'd done what they'd trained for their entire lives to do, and she'd done it alone, in silence, with lethal precision. As they moved to the helicopter for extraction, one of the younger SEALs whispered to Hayes, "That wasn't training, that was something else." Hayes nodded slowly. "Yeah, that was." The classified briefing room at Joint Special Operations Command was silent except for the whirring of the projector. 18 months of operations, 8 confirmed missions across 4 continents, 0 friendly casualties, 3 target extractions with 0 collateral damage, 16 enemy combatants neutralized, and 1 operative who'd begun to transcend the world of normal special operations into something approaching myth. Commander James Richardson, the senior oversight officer for the program, flipped through the mission dossiers with the careful attention of a man handling something fundamentally important. The SEALs in the room, elite operators, men who'd made peace with their own mortality, watched the projections with something approaching reverence. "Sana'a, Yemen," Richardson narrated, pulling up satellite imagery of a densely populated market district. 3 weeks ago, target was a high-level Al-Qaeda operative. Asset location: protected compound in the city center, surrounded by 27 armed guards and 3,000 civilian foot traffic. Mission: extraction without engagement, without exposing the asset, and without being identified as American. The image shifted to footage recovered from security cameras, grainy, disjointed, but unmistakable. A woman in traditional Yemeni dress moved through the crowded market like she was floating. Her burqa concealed her identity completely, but her movement was hypnotic. She glided past vendors, past children, past armed guards, with the absolute confidence of someone who belonged entirely to that place. Her hands, visible occasionally, showed the precise madra movements of a Yemeni woman comfortable in her own culture. "She spent 45 minutes in that market," Richardson said. 45 minutes walking past an asset who was actively being watched by 3 separate Al-Qaeda security teams. Not one of them suspected her. Not one of them looked at her twice. A SEAL named Tors raised his hand. "How did she do that? The asset should have been recognized." "The asset didn't recognize her either," Richardson replied. "Falcon didn't approach him. She didn't make contact. She passed him exactly 3 times. Each time, she adjusted his position slightly through crowd movement. By the end, he was closer to the compound's northern exit. The extraction team moved in 12 minutes later and had him out before the guards even realized he was gone." The room exhaled quietly. This wasn't extraction. This was psychological manipulation on a scale they'd never encountered. Mogadishu, Somalia, Richardson continued, advancing the presentation. 6 weeks ago, Target was a warlord controlling 3 city blocks and harboring ISIS operatives. Standard extraction parameters would have required a team of 8 to 10 operators. Falcon went in alone. The security footage showed her moving through a market in Mogadishu, but this time she wasn't hiding. She was visible, distinctive, moving with purpose through territory controlled by the warlord's forces. She wore traditional Somali dress but carried herself with the bearing of someone important. When armed men approached her, she didn't run. She engaged them in what appeared to be negotiation. "Somali," Richardson said quietly. She spoke Somali, fluent Somali. The warlord's men were confused enough by her presence that when she presented credentials, forged of course, they actually escorted her into the compound to verify her authorization with the warlord himself. She walked past 3 security checkpoints, Torres whispered, almost to himself. She walked past 6, Richardson corrected. The extraction team moved in 40 minutes later. The target was already waiting at the specified extraction point. Falcon had simply asked the warlord's security chief to have the target brought to a specific room for transfer of custody to external forces. The confusion about her actual authority was enough. They complied. A young SEAL named Patterson, fresh from his second deployment, was taking notes frantically. She just talked her way into a terrorist stronghold. She didn't just talk, another SEAL interjected. His name was Hayes and he'd been on Falcon's first 3 operations. She became someone who belonged there. That's different. Anyone can talk a good game. Falcon actually makes you believe she's supposed to be there. There's something in her bearing, her confidence, the way she moves. You stop questioning her. Richardson nodded. That ability has proven to be her greatest asset. It transcends language, transcends culture. She has an intuitive understanding of authority structures and how to exploit them. The presentation continued through 6 more operations. In Damascus, she'd walked into a Syrian government intelligence facility by convincing the guards she was a visiting inspector from the ministry. In Lagos, she'd negotiated with a Nigerian crime lord for the release of an American asset by understanding the precise social pressure that would make compliance preferable to resistance. In Bangkok, she'd extracted a whistleblower from a hotel room on a high-security floor by convincing hotel staff. She was hotel management conducting an internal security audit. But the most chilling operation was Islamabad. 3 months ago, Richardson said, his voice dropping. The target was a high-value Taliban facilitator with direct links to command structure. He was protected by 22 armed guards in a private compound in a residential neighborhood. We had intelligence suggesting he would leave the compound for a diplomatic meeting. Falcon's mission was to intercept during transit. The footage showed a traffic intersection, a black vehicle, the target's transport. Then Falcon appeared, seemingly from nowhere, stepping directly in front of the vehicle. The driver swerved to avoid her. The vehicle's momentum carried it into a deliberately placed obstruction that had been positioned the night before. In the confusion of the accident, Richardson narrated, Falcon moved to the vehicle and extracted the target by convincing him that she was a covert asset positioned to help him escape his kidnappers. The guards were in the process of stabilizing the vehicle and checking for injuries when she'd already escorted the target 2 blocks away. Patterson looked up from his notes. She made the target think he was being rescued by someone on his side. Exactly, Hayes confirmed. She doesn't just understand tactics and psychology. She understands the specific psychology of the person she's manipulating. She gets inside their head before they even realize she's there. There's something else, Richardson said, pulling up a psychological evaluation. Every operator Falcon has worked with reports the same phenomenon. When she's in a room, they become more effective. Their decision-making improves. Their threat assessment becomes sharper. Their operational judgment clarifies. It's as if working with her elevates everyone around her to a higher level of performance. That's cult of personality, Torres suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. No, Hayes said firmly. It's not charisma, it's something else. When you're working with Falcon, you stop second-guessing yourself. You trust your instincts more. You become more decisive because you're watching her be decisive. It's like, he paused, searching for words. It's like she's rewriting the operational rules while you're executing them. Richardson closed the presentation. In 18 months, Falcon has conducted 8 major operations. She's been deployed with 32 different SEAL operators across these missions. We have 32 reports from operators requesting future deployment with her. We have 0 reports of anyone wanting to work with her only once. Every single person who's been paired with her wants to be paired with her again. The room fell silent. This was unprecedented. Elite operators didn't have preferences like this. SEAL teams were fungible. They worked with whoever was assigned. But Falcon had created a demand that transcended normal command structure. The intelligence community has started calling her the Ghost, Richardson continued. Because no one can explain how she does what she does. No training manual covers her methodology. No psychological profile explains her abilities. She simply arrives at locations that should be impossible to infiltrate, does things that shouldn't work, and then disappears like she was never there. Patterson raised his hand. What about her actual combat capability, the hand-to-hand, the weapons training? Hayes smiled grimly. She's a SEAL-level operator in every conventional metric, but that's not what makes her dangerous. What makes her dangerous is that she doesn't need conventional combat. She outthinks people before they ever reach for a weapon. She's redefining what special operations means, Richardson said quietly. And frankly, that terrifies everyone above my pay grade. She's too valuable to lose. She's too dangerous to unleash without constraint. And she's too talented to ever return to normal military service. As the briefing concluded and operators filed out, Hayes lingered. Richardson looked at him with the expression of someone carrying an impossible burden. Is she still fully operational? Richardson asked. As far as I know, Hayes replied. But sir, with respect, I think we need to have a conversation about what happens when an asset like that starts asking questions about what we're actually doing with her. Richardson nodded slowly. I've been waiting for that conversation. I'm not sure either of us will survive it. Washington Post article never ran. The judge's order came down at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, sealing the story before it could be published. Rebecca learned about it not from official channels but from a terrified phone call from David. He'd been contacted by the journalist writing the piece. Apparently he was listed in the investigative notes as a personal connection. The journalist wanted comment about his relationship with Rebecca Martinez, an FBI operative involved in classified military operations. David didn't understand what he was being asked to confirm or deny. Neither did Rebecca when she received the formal notification from her handler that her operational security had been compromised. She had 72 hours before the full debrief, 72 hours to figure out her response. She called David from a secure line, using a voice modulator that made her sound like someone else. She told him to stop answering journalist inquiries. She told him not to discuss their relationship with anyone. She told him things that made it clear the woman he'd been dating for 4 years was fundamentally different from who he thought she was. David's voice broke when he asked, "When are you coming home?" She didn't have an answer. The safe house was in upstate New York, a nondescript cottage near the Canadian border that the program maintained for operatives who needed isolation. Rebecca arrived on a gray November afternoon, carrying a single duffel bag containing everything she owned that mattered. A photograph of her mother, a set of dog tags from her days with the FBI's hostage rescue team, and a journal she'd kept since she was 16 years old. For the first time in 18 months, she had no mission, no briefing, No objective, just her and the silence of the Adirondack forest surrounding the cottage. The unraveling happened slowly, then all at once. On the second day, she called her mother. She'd been avoiding the call for months, canceling visits, giving excuses about classified deployments. When her mother answered, Rebecca almost hung up. Instead, she listened to her mother talk about the upcoming holidays, about her garden, about how much she missed her daughter. Rebecca said nothing. What could she say? That she was a weapon developed by the U.S. military, that she'd killed at least 16 people, that the woman her mother raised had been systematically reconstructed into something that could move through the world invisible and lethal. Mija, her mother said, and the Spanish diminutive nearly broke Rebecca completely. Are you okay? You sound like you're very far away. I am, Rebecca whispered and then hung up. On the fourth day, she attempted to write a letter to David. She started 17 times. Dear David, never got past that opening. How did you explain that the woman he'd made plans with, the woman he'd imagined a future with, no longer existed? How did you articulate that you'd voluntarily dismantled your own capacity for normal human connection? She burned all 17 attempts in the fireplace. On the sixth day, the panic attack came. Rebecca was standing in the kitchen making coffee when she suddenly couldn't breathe. Her chest constricted. Her vision narrowed. Her hands started shaking so badly she dropped the coffee cup. It shattered on the floor and the sound triggered something primal. She found herself on the kitchen floor, gasping, unable to remember how to control her own breathing. All the training at the forge, all the psychological conditioning, all the tactical discipline, none of it prepared her for the moment when her own mind became the enemy. It lasted 40 minutes. When it passed, she sat on the kitchen floor surrounded by broken ceramic, and she cried. Not the controlled, calculated tears of an operative managing emotions. Real tears. Actual grief for the person she'd been and the person she'd become. On the eighth day, Richardson visited. He arrived in a black SUV with 2 security personnel who waited outside. Richardson was different in person than in the classified briefings. Older, smaller, more worn by the weight of his decisions. He carried himself like a man who'd made choices he couldn't unmake and had to live with the consequences. How are you managing? He asked, sitting across from her at the cottage's dining table. I'm not, Rebecca said, and the honesty surprised her. She'd been trained to always project competence, always appear controlled. I've killed 16 people. The woman I loved thinks I'm a ghost. My mother believes I'm betraying her by not coming home. And I exist in a database somewhere as an asset that doesn't officially exist. So no, I'm not managing well. Richardson nodded slowly. The psychological cost of what we've asked you to become is substantial. We knew that when we recruited you. Did you know I'd fall apart? Rebecca asked. We knew it was possible. We hoped your training would inoculate you against it. He paused. The program wants to extend your contract. 5 more years with increased autonomy and higher-level missions. Rebecca laughed, and it sounded slightly unhinged. You want me to sign up for another 5 years of slowly disappearing? We want you to choose it consciously, Richardson said. We're not forcing you. You can walk away. You can take the severance package, go into civilian life with a new identity, and disappear into the normal world. But you'll always know what you're capable of. You'll always understand that there are things happening in the shadows that most people never see. That knowledge doesn't go away. Is that a threat? It's a reality, Richardson said. You can't unknow what you know. You can't become untrained in what we've trained you to do. The question is whether you want to continue using those abilities or spend the rest of your life running from them. Rebecca looked at her hands. These hands had killed. These hands had manipulated psychological vulnerabilities. These hands had saved lives and destroyed them. She couldn't see a future where those hands did ordinary things, typed emails, held a normal person's hand, built a normal life. If I extend the contract, she said carefully, do I get any of my old life back? No, Richardson said immediately. Your old life is incompatible with this work. David would have to believe you're someone else. Your mother would have to accept that you're not the daughter she raised. Your old identity would need to remain buried. So I'm choosing between two kinds of death, Rebecca said. Death by slow separation from everything that made me human, or death by pretending to be someone I'm not in the normal world. Yes, Richardson said. It was refreshing in a terrible way that he didn't try to sugarcoat it. Rebecca stood and walked to the window. The forest beyond was dark, November having stripped the trees bare. She thought about David waiting for a phone call that would make sense of her disappearance. She thought about her mother waiting for a daughter who wasn't coming home. She thought about Falcon, this thing she'd become, and the fact that Falcon had no future except as long as she could be useful to people like Richardson. I need more time, she said. You have 30 days, Richardson replied. After that, we move you into the next operational cycle or process your discharge papers. He left the cottage as silently as he'd arrived. Rebecca stayed at the window, watching the darkness, and understood with absolute clarity that her real war had just begun. Not the wars in Yemen and Somalia and Pakistan and Syria. Those were external, manageable, winnable. This war was internal, a war against everything she'd sacrificed to become, against every relationship she'd abandoned, against the fundamental human need to belong somewhere. This was the war that would decide whether Falcon survived, or whether Rebecca Martinez finally returned. And unlike the other wars, Rebecca had no certainty about which outcome she actually wanted. The mission brief came through encrypted channels on a Thursday morning. Rebecca had been at the safe house for 19 days, existing in a state of suspended animation, neither accepting nor refusing Richardson's contract extension. The brief was marked flash priority, which meant it bypassed normal review cycles and came directly from someone at the highest levels of command. The target was Alexander Volkov, Russian arms dealer operating from a fortified dacha outside Moscow. The brief contained photographs, financial records, communications intercepts. Volkov was selling weapons to ISIS operatives, had connections to North Korean nuclear programs, and had allegedly organized the assassination of a Russian journalist who'd been investigating his activities. By every metric, he was a legitimate target for elimination. But the word elimination was the problem. Rebecca read the brief 3 times, her mind processing the information, the implications, and the fundamental line being crossed. Every previous mission had parameters: extraction, reconnaissance, asset recovery, intelligence gathering. This was different. This was murder, assassination, an extrajudicial execution conducted by a U.S. operative on Russian soil without any legal framework or diplomatic cover. She typed a single email to her handler: I refuse. The response came within minutes: stand by for clarification. By evening, Richardson was on a secure video call, his face appearing on the encrypted screen, with the grim expression of someone who'd already anticipated this moment. You understand the strategic importance of this target, Richardson said without preamble. I understand you're asking me to commit murder, Rebecca replied. Not military action, not tactical elimination in defense of American lives. Murder, assassination, the very thing we criticize other nations for conducting. The very thing, Richardson said coldly, that keeps American soldiers alive. Volkov's weapons are being used against our forces in Syria and Iraq. His ISIS connections have resulted in American deaths. This is not murder. This is elimination of a threat. That's what they all say, Rebecca responded. That's what every intelligence agency says when they decide someone needs to die without trial, without evidence presented, without any of the legal safeguards that supposedly separate us from the people we're fighting. Richardson was silent for a long moment. You accepted the contract knowing that the program operated in gray areas. You conducted 8 missions understanding that some of those operations existed in legal ambiguity. Extraction is different than assassination, Rebecca said. Reconnaissance is different than premeditated murder. You're asking me to cross from operating in gray areas to operating in absolute darkness. I won't do it. Then you're refusing a direct order, Richardson said quietly. Yes, Rebecca confirmed, I am. The line went dead. Within 4 hours, federal agents arrived at the safe house. They didn't arrest her. There were no charges that could be pressed, no crime she'd technically committed. Instead, they sealed the property. She was informed that her apartment in Virginia had been sealed. Her bank accounts had been frozen. Her operational credentials had been deactivated. She was placed in protective custody in a nondescript hotel in Baltimore, surrounded by federal marshals who treated her with the careful distance of people guarding something dangerous. She was being disappeared. That night, alone in the hotel room, Rebecca made a decision that would reshape everything that followed. She contacted a Congressional Oversight Committee member she'd worked with during her FBI days, Senator Margaret Hayes, no relation to Commander Marcus Hayes. Senator Hayes had always expressed concern about black budget operations and the potential for abuse. Rebecca knew the risks. She knew that testifying would end her career, would likely result in criminal charges, would destroy her life definitively and completely. But remaining silent meant tacitly endorsing a program that was slowly transforming from intelligence operations into state-sanctioned assassination. It meant accepting that Falcon, this thing she'd become, was going to exist in the shadows forever, conducting murders that would never be public, never be accountable, never be questioned. I want to testify, Rebecca told Senator Hayes in a phone call conducted through channels so secure that even the federal marshals guarding her didn't know she was communicating. About the program, about what they've done to me, about what they're trying to make me do. There was a long silence on the line. Then, you understand what you're asking. This will expose classified information. You'll be imprisoned. Your identity will eventually become public. Every detail of your operational history will be investigated. I understand, Rebecca said. I'm ready. Are you? Senator Hayes asked. Because once you start down this road, there's no returning. You'll have destroyed not just yourself, but people you've worked with, operators who trusted you. Rebecca thought about the SEALs she'd worked with over 18 months. Hayes, Torres, Patterson, the dozen others who'd come to respect her, who'd followed her into danger, who'd trusted her judgment in impossible situations. She thought about how they'd be questioned, investigated, potentially sacrificed because of her refusal. They deserve to know what the program actually is, Rebecca said. They deserve to understand that they're being used to conduct operations that violate international law. If my refusal exposes that, then that's the cost. Within a week, congressional committees were being briefed. Within 2 weeks, classified information about the program was being shared with oversight committees. Within a month, the investigation had reached the highest levels of the Pentagon. The briefing room where Rebecca testified was windowless and climate-controlled to an almost painful degree. Senators, congresspeople, military brass, intelligence community representatives, all of them gathered to hear from the operative known as Falcon. She was sworn in like a normal witness, though nothing about the situation was normal. For 14 hours, she described the program in meticulous detail. The recruitment, the training at the forge, the psychological conditioning, the operations conducted in legal gray zones, the targets eliminated without trial, the missions that served strategic interests rather than direct defense of American lives. She didn't minimize her own culpability. She'd killed 16 people. She'd manipulated vulnerable individuals. She'd participated in a system designed to transcend normal legal and ethical constraints. When asked why she was testifying, she was honest. Because I became the weapon they wanted me to become, and I realized that weapon was being aimed at targets the U.S. government had no legal right to eliminate. I participated in creating a system that operates entirely without accountability. I participated in becoming something that should not exist in a democratic nation. The SEALs didn't abandon her. Instead, they submitted their own statements. Commander Hayes called the program a dangerous evolutionary dead end that compromised American military integrity. Commander Richardson was quietly removed from his position. 2 officials resigned. 2 faced criminal investigations. But the consequences for Rebecca were immediate and severe. Her discharge papers were classified. Her entire operational record was sealed. Her identity was compartmentalized so thoroughly that official documentation of her existence was nearly erased. She was given a new identity, a severance package of $2 million, and relocated to Portland, Oregon. She was prohibited from discussing any aspect of the program under penalty of severe criminal charges. She'd won. She'd destroyed the program that had tried to destroy her. She'd exposed the machinery of black operations that had been designed to exist forever in the shadows. But victory felt a lot like another kind of death. As she sat in her new apartment in Portland, looking out at a city where no one knew her real name, Rebecca understood that she'd saved the nation's soul but lost her own place in the world. She was neither Falcon nor Rebecca Martinez anymore. She was something in between, a ghost who'd chosen to haunt the systems that had created her. The investigation that followed Rebecca's testimony became the most classified political event in American intelligence history. Officially, it never happened. Unofficially, it tore through the upper echelons of the Pentagon and intelligence community like a carefully targeted surgical strike. Senator Margaret Hayes, who had become Rebecca's primary congressional advocate, convened a closed-door committee on special operations accountability. The hearings were conducted in the secure chambers beneath the Capitol building, in rooms that had been swept for listening devices and isolated from electronic surveillance. Rebecca attended 14 separate sessions, each one peeling back another layer of the program's existence. The intelligence officials who appeared before the committee were uniformly defensive. They argued necessity. They cited national security. They presented classified assessments of terrorist threats that supposedly justified operating outside normal legal frameworks. But the evidence Rebecca and other witnesses provided was damning. Financial records, operational logs, communications showing that decisions about targeting were being made by people without proper authority, without legal review, and without accountability mechanisms. By the 3rd week of testimony, the first official fell. Deputy Director of Central Intelligence James Whitmore resigned to spend more time with his family. 3 days later, the media, tipped off by someone inside the investigation, reported that he was under criminal investigation for authorization of unauthorized renditions. The carefully maintained facade that this was a resignation for personal reasons crumbled immediately. By the end of the month, 2 more officials had resigned under similar circumstances. But the political cost was extraordinary, even for those defending the program's existence. Senator Hayes invited Rebecca to her office during a recess in the hearings. It was the first time they'd met in person since the investigation began. Hayes was in her 60s, with silver hair and eyes that carried the particular weariness of someone who'd spent decades fighting against institutional resistance to change. "They're offering me a deal," Hayes said without preamble. "A compromise. The program gets terminated officially. A few officials take criminal charges to satisfy public demand for accountability, but in exchange the entire investigation gets sealed. No public report. No congressional findings made public. The program simply disappears." Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. That's not accountability, that's just damage control. "Yes," Hayes agreed, "but it's also the only deal that's currently on the table. The Pentagon is threatening to withhold cooperation with other military matters if the investigation continues. The intelligence community is threatening to compromise specific ongoing operations if details become public. They're holding the entire national security apparatus hostage to protect the program. So what do I do? Rebecca asked. You decide, Hayes said. We can accept the compromise and watch most of this get buried, or we can push for public accountability and risk genuine national security breaches. There's no clean victory here. Rebecca stood and walked to the window of Hayes' office. Below, Washington sprawled in its usual organized chaos, the machinery of government, the complexity of power, the collision between idealism and pragmatism. She thought about the 16 people she'd killed. She thought about the operators she'd worked with. She thought about the institution that had created her. How much can we declassify? She asked. Some, Hayes said. Not everything, but enough to establish that the program existed, that it operated in legal gray areas, and that certain officials knew it was crossing ethical lines. Enough for the historical record. Then that's what we do, Rebecca said. We get as much public truth as we can, accept the compromise, and move on. The final agreement took 3 months to negotiate. The program was officially terminated. 4 officials resigned or were fired. 1 faced indictment on charges of exceeding his legal authority. The classified report, the real report, not the sanitized version for public consumption, was filed into congressional archives marked for future declassification review. The public narrative was carefully managed. A special operations program designed with good intentions had gradually evolved beyond appropriate oversight. Reforms were being implemented. Congressional mechanisms for monitoring black budget operations were being strengthened. Everything was being addressed. The implication that America was safe from this kind of abuse was carefully maintained, even though Rebecca knew the truth was far more complex. The SEALs handled the aftermath with quiet professionalism. Commander Marcus Hayes, unlike the intelligence officials who'd been sacrificed, was protected by his operational record and the support of his subordinates. The SEALs who'd worked with Rebecca submitted statements defending the integrity of operators while acknowledging that the program structure had been fundamentally flawed. It was a careful distinction, protecting the warriors while exposing the war itself. But there was something more significant happening in the classified training world. Navy Training Command quietly began implementing something they called the Falcon Protocol, a set of tactical and decision-making frameworks that emphasized innovation, precision, and ethical clarity. Young operators studied the methodology without knowing her name. Declassified documents referenced Agent Falcon in ways that felt almost mythical. She'd become a legend that couldn't be named, an influence that couldn't be acknowledged, a guide for future operators on how to think about the intersection of capability and conscience. Rebecca's discharge came through in February. The paperwork was classified, the process sealed, her operational record hidden behind security clearances that future researchers would spend decades trying to access. She was given a new social security number, a new driver's license, and a new name. Sarah Chen, former private security consultant, relocating to Portland, Oregon for a fresh start. The severance was substantial, $2 million, but the cost was complete. She couldn't contact David. She couldn't call her mother. She couldn't acknowledge her own history. She didn't exist in any official capacity. Every achievement, every operation, every moment of becoming the person she'd been was now classified beyond public knowledge. In her final meeting with Senator Hayes, the senator handed her an unmarked envelope. "What is this?" Rebecca asked. "Your real discharge papers," Hayes said. "Not the classified version. Everything you actually did, everything you actually are. Documented, signed, sealed. I'm giving you a copy because you deserve to know that what you did mattered, that your testimony changed the trajectory of American intelligence operations, that institutions do listen when someone is willing to break." Rebecca opened the envelope. It contained a detailed record of her entire service: recruitment, training, operations, testimony. A historical document that would never be made public but would exist in the archive of her own memory. The investigators called me after your testimony, Hayes continued. They said something I've never forgotten. They said that they'd been prepared to build a system like this regardless, that if you hadn't existed, they'd have recruited someone else. They'd have created Falcon whether you volunteered or not. By refusing the assassination mission, by testifying, by forcing accountability, you prevented the next iteration. You prevented the program from becoming permanent. Rebecca held the envelope like it was made of glass. Does that make me feel better? No, Hayes said honestly. But it should help you understand that your sacrifice wasn't pointless. You saved people you'll never meet from situations you'll never know about. Rebecca left Washington carrying that envelope and an understanding that she'd fundamentally changed the course of American intelligence operations. She'd also lost everything: her identity, her relationships, her future. The cost and the benefit were so perfectly balanced that she couldn't determine which was greater. As she boarded the plane to Portland, Rebecca understood that she'd completed the most dangerous mission of her life. Not in Afghanistan or Somalia or Pakistan, but in the halls of power, facing down the system that had created her and refusing to become the permanent weapon it had intended. She was finally free, but freedom, she was learning, looked an awful lot like another kind of imprisonment. The crisis hotline office was in a converted warehouse in Portland's Pearl District, staffed by volunteers who trained to recognize the particular language of human desperation. Sarah Chen, as she'd legally become, had been volunteering there for 3 years. She worked the evening shift from 6 p.m. to midnight, listening to people at their worst moments: suicidal ideation, relationship collapse, the slow dissolution of meaning. She was qualified for the work in ways she could never explain. Her apartment was 6 blocks away, a modest 1-bedroom overlooking the Willamette River. She'd furnished it minimally: a bed, a desk, a bookshelf filled with philosophy, psychology, and history. She had no photographs on the walls, no personal mementos visible to anyone who might visit. The only personal item she kept was the envelope Senator Hayes had given her, locked in a safe deposit box at a bank in downtown Portland. She visited it once a year, on the anniversary of her discharge, to remind herself that she'd actually existed before she became Sarah Chen. The woman who called the hotline that Tuesday night was named Jennifer, and she'd just discovered her husband's affair. Jennifer was spiraling, saying things about how she couldn't live without him, how her entire identity had been defined by being his wife, how she might as well be dead. Sarah listened with the particular attention she'd learned to give, identifying the specific texture of Jennifer's despair. "What would happen if you were completely erased?" Sarah asked quietly. "What?" Jennifer was confused by the question. "What if everyone you knew, your husband, your family, your friends, what if they all forgot you existed? If you had to start your entire life over with a completely new identity, new name, new history, what would you do?" The question was drawn from experience that Jennifer would never know about. Sarah had asked herself that question 1,000 times. I don't know," Jennifer said, her voice uncertain. "That's okay," Sarah continued. "But I'm going to tell you something. I've been completely erased. I exist on no official records. No one I knew before exists in my current life, and I'm still alive, I'm still here, and I've found meaning in the strangest places." She paused. "You're not your husband's wife, Jennifer. That's what you're learning, and it's painful, but it's also liberation. Who are you when nobody's defining you?" Jennifer cried on the phone for another 20 minutes. By the end of the call, she was starting to see possibility in her own erasure rather than just devastation. Sarah didn't know if the call would save Jennifer's life. She'd learned that she couldn't carry responsibility for outcomes she couldn't control. But she offered something she'd spent years learning to offer: the understanding that complete loss can sometimes be the precondition for genuine change. After her shift ended, Sarah walked along the riverside, as she did most evenings. The Willamette was moving toward the Pacific, water flowing inevitably downriver toward dissolution and reformation. She often thought about what it meant to flow toward something you couldn't see, to let go of every identity and structure and trust that what emerged on the other side would be worth the dissolution. The memory came to her unbidden, as memories often did. A classified briefing at Joint Special Operations Command. A young SEAL named Patterson was giving a presentation on decision-making under tactical stress. His methodology was drawn directly from the Falcon protocol, the framework that had been built from Rebecca Martinez's operational approaches, disseminated throughout the military training establishment without ever publicly acknowledging her existence. Patterson, who would never know her real name, was teaching other operators how to think the way she'd learned to think. He was passing forward a legacy that couldn't be attributed, a body of knowledge that would shape operators for decades, perhaps centuries. She'd become a ghost haunting American military training. She'd become methodology. She'd become a way of approaching problems that transcended any single person. In a strange way, she'd achieved immortality, not through public recognition, but through the invisible influence of her thinking becoming so embedded in institutional practice that people forgot it had come from a single human being. By 2015, the Naval Special Warfare Development Group had formally documented the Falcon Protocol as part of their tactical curriculum. Young operators studied it. Established commanders referenced it. International military observers requested access to the classified details. She'd fundamentally reshaped how America's most elite warriors thought about decision-making and ethical operation. But not a single document acknowledged that the methodology came from a woman named Rebecca Martinez. That spring, Sarah received a visitor, something that had never happened in her 3 years in Portland. Commander Marcus Hayes appeared at her apartment on a Saturday afternoon, dressed in civilian clothes, carrying a single folder. "The classified restrictions on your testimony are being loosened," Hayes said without preamble. "In 50 years, researchers will be able to access the full details. Congressional oversight has requested that we maintain documentation for historical purposes. Your name won't be public, but your contribution will be acknowledged in archival materials." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, not quite relief, but something approaching it. The idea that someday, decades from now, historians would know that Falcon had been Rebecca Martinez, that the legacy wasn't anonymous after all, that evidence of her existence would survive in classified archives. "Thank you for coming," Sarah said. "The SEALs wanted you to know something," Hayes continued. "The Falcon Protocol is now doctrine. It's mandatory training. Every operator trained in the last 3 years has learned from your methodology. The next generation of warriors is being shaped by your thinking." "They don't know it's my thinking," Sarah said quietly. "No," Hayes agreed. "But that's also the point, isn't it? It's become bigger than any individual. It's become something that transcends attribution. That's a different kind of immortality." After Hayes left, Sarah stood on her balcony watching the river. She thought about the woman she'd been, the FBI agent, the trainee at the forge, the operative called Falcon. She thought about the lives she'd saved and the lives she'd taken. She thought about the program she'd destroyed and the legacy she'd inadvertently created. She'd sacrificed everything to become a weapon. Then she'd sacrificed her identity to refuse that weaponization. Now she was sacrificing her public recognition to allow her legacy to exist independently of her own name. Each sacrifice had felt like death, but each had also been liberation. That evening at the crisis hotline, a new caller came through, a young man who just finished military service and couldn't adjust to civilian life. He talked about the training he'd received, about a framework called the Falcon Protocol that had changed how he thought about decision-making under stress. "It saved my life," he said, "not because it made me a better soldier, but because it taught me that I could choose what to do with my capabilities, that I could think for myself instead of just following orders." Sarah listened and she understood. Somewhere in the vast machinery of military training, Her influence was rippling outward, changing lives, shaping decisions, creating operators who would themselves train other operators. She'd become something larger than her own existence. She'd become a principle, a methodology, a way of approaching impossible questions. By midnight, when her shift ended, Sarah had resolved something. She wouldn't pursue the declassification. She wouldn't fight to have her name attached to the Falcon protocol. Instead, she'd let it exist as she existed, as an invisible force, moving through institutions and lives, changing things without needing credit or recognition. She walked home along the riverside, the city lights reflecting off the water. Somewhere, young operators were studying her methodology without knowing who'd created it. Somewhere, the program she'd helped destroy was being replaced by systems with actual oversight and accountability. Somewhere, the machinery of power was moving, incrementally, toward something slightly more ethical. And Sarah Chen, who'd once been Rebecca Martinez, who'd once been called Falcon, walked quietly through Portland, invisible and complete. She taught the world's deadliest warriors that true strength wasn't about doing everything. It was about knowing what not to do. And in learning that lesson herself, she'd finally found the peace that had eluded her through all the violence and sacrifice. The Falcon had learned to rest, not in triumph, not in defeat, but in the quiet understanding that the work was done, that her legacy would outlive her name, that the most powerful influence was the one that transcended attribution and became simply the way things were done. She was free, and this time freedom felt like home. The end.
Ha sburracchiato tutto laggiù, mi ha sburracchiato. Dai, togliti. Ah, ci sono le grate anche di là, mi sa. Come faccio a tornare dall'altra parte? Come torno dall'altra parte? Non ci arrivo fino là sopra. Se salgo qua sopra. Sali. Sali bene. Scusa, come ritorno dall'altra parte? Non posso. Ma non posso tornare di là? Ma? Ok, questo è strano. Questo è insolito, devo dire. È blu, non è bianco, quindi non posso. Ma... Cioè, devo ammazzarmi per forza se voglio tornare dall'altra parte? No, non è possibile, perché devo venire qua a schiacciare il tasto? C'è qualcosa che non sto considerando, evidentemente. Ah, ok, ce l'ho.